Thank you, Alex. I'm Robert O'Connor, author of Jeep Show. As you know, writing a book is like climbing a mountain. While I was researching, writing, and rewriting Jeep Show, I sometimes became demoralized. To improve my morale, I would imagine an opportunity like this, to talk about my work with a distinguished historian like you, to talk about my work with the many friends of the National World War II Memorial. I'm profoundly grateful. I only wish this World War II veteran who served overseas at the age of 19 was with me today, Robert O'Connor, my dad. I have learned that an important goal of the Friends of the National World War II Memorial is teaching lessons of yesterday to unite generations of tomorrow. The lesson that Jeep Show attempts to teach is the importance of morale and how we foster it in each other. Let me ask you a question. What do the following 6 men have in common? Mickey Rooney, the #1 Hollywood box office star in 1939. Carl Reiner, a pioneering comedian, writer, director, and actor. Sammy Davis Jr., an extraordinary singer, dancer, actor, and impressionist. Pete Seeger, an American folk music icon and lifelong advocate for grassroots democracy. Don Knotts, a talented comedian remembered for his brilliant role as Deputy Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show. Jim Hetzer, a West Virginia-based promoter whose circuses toured the U.S. and Canada for over 40 years. What did these 6 men have in common? They were all in the U.S. Army in World War II. They were all military occupation specialty 442. They were all entertainment specialists. They were all in the Morale Corps. Jeep Show is about the Morale Corps, this forgotten group of soldiers in our World War II Army. It is also about combat infantry. It is about morale and the importance of being present for each other during hard times. Entertainment specialists in the Morale Corps had 3 main jobs. In the rear echelon, they organized amateur theater using GIs for cast and crew. This was to keep young men with Army pay in their pockets and time on their hands away from less wholesome pursuits. Entertainment specialists also made visits to wounded soldiers and airmen in Army hospitals. Let me read you an excerpt from Jeep Show that illustrates this duty. Mickey Rooney jumps up on the hospital train as it hisses to a stop. There are no seats on the car he enters. It's all wounded, head to boots on stretchers, 6 across, about a foot clearance on each side. Several of the men have plasma bottles above their right shoulders. A few have their eyes open. It's quiet, except for snoring and the occasional groan. There is no nurse or medic in the car. Mickey kneels. "How you doing, soldier?" "Mickey Rooney," the soldier says. "I'll be damned. You prefer Betty Grable, I know. Say, how'd you get this light duty?" "Stepped on a shoe mine, Hurtgen Forest. Every man in this car is 28th Division." "You're in for a month of ice cream," Mickey says. As he leaves the car, Mickey turns back and shouts, "All aboard! Destination Garsh and the American 1st General Hospital. 3 hots a day, fresh linens, and sponge baths from topless nurses. And miles out of 88 range." Smiles appear on a few faces of the men on the floor. The rest are in sedative comas, simply unconscious, too weak to react, or in the case of 25-year-old Sergeant Joseph Emmerbach of Waterloo, Iowa, recently deceased. Finally, in the combat zone, entertainment soldiers put on shows, Jeep shows, for combat infantry in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go. I've spoken with many historians who specialize in World War II and many students of World War II. None have ever heard of enlisted entertainers or Jeep shows. I discovered this forgotten service while researching a book I intended to write about one of Jim Hetzer's most memorable circus productions. It was the Oxydol Circus, a 1968 marketing disaster for Procter & Gamble, humorous only in retrospect, but the story for another day. As part of my research, I learned that early in 1944, at the age of 29, this same Jim Hetzer enlisted in the Army. Based on his show business experience, he was detailed to the Morale Corps. Jim is on the right here with Mickey Rooney and the third member of their Jeep Show squad. Note in this picture that the 6' 2" tall Jim Hetzer is sitting so as not to tower over his famous 5'1" buddy, Mickey Rooney. Along the way, I learned that Jim's older sister had saved every letter he wrote home from the war. I read them, and I knew I had to write about these soldiers. I have had a long-standing interest in the topic of morale, how we do or don't do the hard things that need to be done when they need to be done. My first book was about that topic. So I had to write Jeep Show, a story about morale inspired by Jim Hetzer, Mickey Rooney, and their wartime service. I decided to write it as a novel because I wanted to drop my protagonist into the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. As you all know, the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. Now, when you start a big project, the universe will sometimes drop what you need right on your doorstep. I had Jim's letters. Then I found the May 1944 ETO USA, that is, European Theater of Operations, United States Army, Morale Services Guide. There was a manual for every job in the Army. This one gave me priceless insight. Also, as part of my research, I visited the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge took place. I visited an area of Luxembourg that had been defended by that 28th Division. The division was dealt heavy blows by the 5th Panzer Army during the first days of the battle. This is a memorial put up by grateful citizens after the war. By the way, the 28th Division was the Pennsylvania National Guard before it was federalized in 1941. The enemy called them the Bloody Bucket Division. The Germans misinterpreted the red Keystone State insignia. I went to Hosingen, a village in Luxembourg on the German border, to see for myself where the German troops attacked the American position on the morning of December 16, 1944. This was the start of what the Americans call the Battle of the Bulge. This is what I saw when I looked across a beet field towards Germany. I wondered how it must have felt to be an American GI that morning, seeing enemy soldiers advancing towards them from the far end of that field. In Jeep Show, Private Jim Tanzer is in a water tower observation post at that very spot, at that very time, on that very day. I'll tell you how he felt. "Take the watch a minute, Jim," Bromberg says as he hands him the binoculars and crouches below the wall to light a cigarette. To look like he knows what he's doing, Jim scans the 180 degrees in front of the water tower, over and back. It's coming on light, over and back. The ground fog is lifting. On the 6th over, he stops on a handful of vibrating squiggles. They become half a dozen small white ghosts. He must be dreaming. More ghosts appear behind them. "What's that yonder, fellas?" Jim says. "Papa 10, this is Mike 3, Bromberg shouts into the walkie-talkie. He gets an answer and lowers his voice. "Company-size formation, cresting the hill, moving west through the beet field, half left of OP Water Tower. Range estimate 500 yards. Adjust fire from Whiskey Papa. Map 22, Whiskey Papa Bear. Grid 5, 1, 3, 4, 2, 3, 6, 7. Over." He turns to Jim. "Look for fall of shot." Jim crouches down as low as possible while still being able to see out. He notices the winter white uniforms as the German attackers begin to move at quick time. They are now the size of flies on a ceiling, 3 groups, each 20 wide, 5 deep. A ripping sound starts in the distance. The Germans bend forward. Kraut machine guns, firing over their heads, Bromberg says, at our boys. We got us a box seat to an infantry assault without armor against a defended position. Krauts must think we were killed by their artillery or we just scrammed. Over his heartbeat, Jim hears a punk. Half a minute later, a brown and white geyser erupts in front of the middle German formation, followed by a pang. 2 Germans drop like abandoned marionettes. A third falls to his knees. The soldiers behind them step forward and continue. As part of my research, I read many letters written home by combat infantry. I read dozens of books, watched videos and films with a notepad in front of me. I watched many training films from the war, including the wildly optimistic How to Kill a Tank, featuring the M1 rocket launcher, nicknamed the Bazooka. Speaking of morale, Sergeant Bill Malden's Willie and Joe cartoons in Stars and Stripes gave voice to the combat soldiers' frustration with Army bureaucracy, cold chow, and life at the front. These 2 characters were beloved by enlisted men and despised by General George Patton and other senior officers. But the Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, recognized the morale value of Malden's cartoons and allowed Willie and Joe to stay in the fight throughout the war. As I said, the lesson Jeep Show emphasizes is the importance of morale. Napoleon put it this way: in war, morale is to the material as 3 is to 1. Morale is essential to victory. Morale is essential to persevering during hard times. And what could be harder than being combat infantry at the front during the Battle of the Bulge? The Army saw morale as a strategic asset in World War II, and so established a morale division in 1940 before the U.S. entered the war to provide entertainment, recreation, and psychological support for troops. The Morale Corps was renamed Special Services in 1941, a fact that I ignored for Jeep Show. I preferred the Morale Corps name. Their mission was to maintain the fighting spirit of troops by providing recreation and cultural stimulation on bases, aboard ships, and, as you now know, at the front. Their primary tactics were movies. Hollywood films were screened to troops worldwide, sometimes in advance of their release in the States. There was also Stars and Stripes, a daily newspaper for soldiers, and Yank, a weekly magazine. The Morale Corps distributed Armed Services Edition books. These were specially printed, sized to fit the pocket of a soldier's field jacket, and often read in foxholes. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was by far the most popular, and the author Betty Smith received thousands of letters from GIs all over the world. There were hundreds of other titles: classics, mysteries, westerns, humor. Over 120 million Armed Services editions were distributed free to U.S. troops during the war. And by the way, one of the great American novels of the 20th century, which was by 1941 out of print and forgotten, that is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, was rescued from oblivion by the Morale Corps. The Morale Corps also oversaw recreation activities, physical fitness programs, and organized sports. They built and managed gyms, pools, libraries, and theaters on bases around the world. The Morale Corps also offered correspondence and live courses to help soldiers pass the time and prepare for post-war life. As I said, entertainment specialists in the Morale Corps produced amateur theater with soldiers as cast and crew. Shows included Soldier's Hamlet, which was much criticized for being abridged, and reviews like Hi Yank that could be customized for the amateur talent available. But, other than books, Morale Corps activities could not be done at the front, so they could not serve the soldiers who needed it the most, when they needed it the most. So Jeep shows had to be invented. I'd like to take a minute now to explain what I came to understand about the experience of American combat infantry in the ETO in World War II. Only about 1 in 5 soldiers were combat troops. The rest were support personnel. This was not unnoticed at the front. In Jeep Show, our protagonist is in a foxhole at Antonio Shaft on December 18, 1944, day 3 of the Bulge. Situated east of Bastogne, Antonio Shaft was a strategically vital crossroads. Our protagonist, Jim, talks with a young soldier named Ali as they watch uncomfortably for advancing German armor coming down the road. Ali points to the Morale Corps insignia on Jim's sleeve. "Hell's bells, Jim. What are you doing at the front?" "I'm trying to get back to my squad," Jim says. "Everybody wants to get to the rear," Ali says, "especially now. Of course, what you think is the rear is going to depend on where you find yourself. If Sergeant picks us out for patrol, this foxhole, 300 yards in front of our tanks, this foxhole is the cozy home we want to get back to. But while we're in this foxhole," Ali jerks his thumb over his shoulder, "back there is the place we want to be. If we're back there, though, platoon command post is the safest place in the world. But if we're at platoon, we'd be thinking about how to get back to company headquarters. At company, we'd look for an excuse to visit battalion. At battalion, we'd begrudge regiment. At regiment, we'd curse the bastards at division. Division wants to be at corps, corps at army, army at base section, and believe it or not, Ripley, base section has a low opinion of soldiers back in the States. Unlike Army Air Force pilots, who were rotated home after a set number of combat missions, American infantry units were rarely, if ever, sent back, even to reconstitute divisions that had been severely depleted. The only way out for combat infantry was to be wounded, killed, or captured. Casualties had to be replaced on an individual basis, usually by soldiers fresh from training camp. This was a dangerous business for the green replacements, until they won the trust of the veterans in their new platoons and learned how to survive in combat. After the late July 1944 breakout from Normandy, American infantry was at the German border by early September. Combat troops outpaced their supply lines by hundreds of miles. This was a morale factor. At Hurtgen Forest and many other places, American combat infantry experienced chronic discomfort, periodic chaos, extreme violence, and the inevitable loss of comrades. Rear echelon soldiers did not share this experience. Morale. Then there was the weather. The historian Rick Atkinson has written, "Winter always seemed to catch the U.S. Army by surprise." I personally wonder if it's because so many generals were from the South. The winter of 1944-45 was the coldest in Europe in decades. The thinking in September 1944 was the war will be over by Christmas. Thus, the Army did an uneven job of supplying winter clothing to frontline infantry. Morale. Other than weapons and ammunition, much of the best supplies never made it to the front. Morale. Frontline infantry were also isolated physically and emotionally from the rest of the Army, let alone from friends and family back in the States. Morale. So, how did our men fight so long and so well? How did they persevere? What was the source of the resilience of our combat soldiers? I tried to capture one reason in a scene in Jeep Show. Retreating west from Antonio Shaft, our protagonist Jim finds himself thrown in with a squad of combat engineers in a farmhouse in front of the Belgian village of Longeville. "Like I said, Sergeant," Jim says, "I'm Morale Corps. I need to get back to my squad." Sergeant Rizzo has had enough. He points to Jim's rifle. "What you got there, Private?" "My rifle, Sergeant," Jim says. "Correct. Private Tanzer, are you a man or a woman? Yes, Sergeant. A man, Jim says. You're a man with a rifle, Sergeant Rizzo continues. You're a goddamn rifleman, Private. And these men, he extends his arm to the other soldiers in the room, are your buddies now. And you are their buddy now. And you don't run down the road, leave your buddies in a tight spot. Capiche? No, Sergeant, I don't. That's right, Private, Sergeant Rizzo says. And we are glad you are here with us. Morale. There's something about physical presence that movies and books do not provide. Jeep shows were not just about being entertaining. They were about being present. The USO and the Red Cross are civilian organizations. They cannot go into combat areas. Joshua Logan directed South Pacific, Annie Get Your Gun, and other Broadway hits. In the Morale Corps during the war, Captain Joshua Logan invented Jeep shows. 3 MOS 442s, Entertainment Specialists, and a drive a Jeep to just behind the front lines, often within artillery range, where combat infantry is pulled back for a hot meal, maybe a uniform exchange. And they put on a show. Morale. Here is Mickey Rooney entertaining the 44th Division. His 2 Jeep show buddies are out of frame behind him. By the way, Mickey Rooney did not have to be there. Mickey Rooney did not have to be danger close to the fighting. He could have enlisted and served honorably making training films at Hal Roach Studios in Hollywood, 10 minutes from his house. That's what Lieutenant Ronald Reagan did. I'm full of admiration for Mickey Rooney. Here is Jim Hetzer and 2 buddies entertaining GIs by murdering a love song. In my book, I describe a Jeep show in Hosingen, Luxembourg, put on by Mickey, Jim, and the 3rd soldier in their Jeep show squad. The acts were as follows. First, a wrestling pantomime lifted from Rooney's 1938 hit Boys Town with Spencer Tracy. Secondly, Mickey sings GI Jive, and Jim and Mickey do eclectic dance steps. Then Mickey does stand-up, including impressions. Now here is a joke I assigned to Mickey that is typical of his comedy routine in Jeep shows. Now you boys know I'd rather fight than tell jokes, Mickey says. I'm the only soldier who can look Tojo in the eye. Laughter. I was going to be a paratrooper. Glory. And $5 more a month. First jump, the red light by the airplane door switches on. I'm too scared to move. Jumpmaster says to me, jump or I'll put my boot up your keister. Jim, from the wings. Did you jump, Mickey? Mickey shrugs. Just a little. Next in the performance, a GI is pulled out of the audience to perform for his buddies. Mickey pulls a thin, dark-haired young man in a shiny uniform up to the microphone. Private Levy was a cantor in Newark before the war, Mickey says to K Company. We heard him sing at the Repo Depot a few weeks back. Give him a warm welcome. There is applause and calls of encouragement. Private Levy is a replacement. Born in Ansbach, Germany, son of a kosher butcher, Levy emigrated to the United States in 1936 at the age of 12. He is nervous in front of his fellow GIs. But now they know his name. His chances of surviving the war have increased. Then in the show, Jim recites a Hamlet parody about Army Chow. KP or not KP? That is the question. Mickey plays the drums on a jerry can, and they end the show by singing, I'll Be Seeing You. Jeep shows were an immediate success. Here is the text of a December 1944 memo to General Courtney Hodges, commander of the U.S. First Army. 6 Jeep shows were attached to 20 Corps on 5 December 1944. Every effort was made to book the teams with the combat troops, close to the front. The benefit to morale from these soldiers putting on shows in places formerly thought unapproachable with entertainment has made their performance of duty exceptionally valuable to this command. This office urgently requests additional Jeep shows. Morale. Jeep shows gave combat infantry a sense that they were not forgotten. It was not just the show, it was the physical presence of the entertainment soldiers. As one GI recalled, they didn't have to say a word, just seeing them there, knowing someone came all this way just to try to cheer us up. It made us feel like we were still human. As a Brit, Alex Kershaw knows about ENSA, E-N-S-A, the Entertainment National Service Association that did shows for British soldiers during World War II. The Tommies fondly referred to ENSA as, every night, something awful. In Jeep Show, an ENSA performer tells Jim about the importance of being present. I did a 7th tour of Africa in '42. Now imagine you're a 19-year-old Tommy from Lancashire, the comedian continues. Never been farther than Blackpool for a donkey ride. Him and his mates are guarding an oil field in Libya, 1,000 miles from home. Mail and rations delivered once a month. 120 degrees at noon, sandflies. Can't even get Lord Ha-Ha on the wireless. Well, you're chuffed to see anyone from England, aren't you? Scotland will do, even Ireland, he says in a flimsy brogue. You're good with impressions, Jim says, to be agreeable. Not a bit, the comedian says. My act is half pie. I'm no name and never will be. Don't have the gifts. But the thing is, Jim, morale is the showing up, the being there, the performance, sure, but also the natter over tea and a biscuit, letting the lads know they're not forgotten. That I can do. If we reflect on our own lives, friends going through hard times don't need us to give them all the answers, even if we could. They need us to be there with them, to take a walk, play cards, watch a ball game. They need us to be present. That is the thing we can do that helps the most. I was able to use a fighting, stumbling retreat by the fictional Jim Tanzer to describe actual battles that took place in Hosingen, Clairvaux, Antonio Schaff, Longvally, and of course, Bastogne. Bastogne was where survivors from overrun combat units, as well as rear echelon soldiers, switchboard operators, mechanics, bakers, barbers, and, in my book, an entertainment specialist named Jim Tanzer. Bastogne is where they were organized into Team Snafu. Snafu, situation normal, all effed up. At Bastogne, these Team Snafu soldiers turned and fought, died, some of them, in crucial and anonymous support of the gallant 101st Airborne Division. Morale. I want to close on a character Jim Tanzer meets in Bastogne, a war correspondent, a.k.a. the Warco. This character was inspired by the famous World War II Warco, Ernie Pyle. I created the Warco to explain things to Jim Tanzer that I wanted my readers to know, but could not tell them myself. I had the Warco write a column looking back on the war for his newspaper in early 1946. The column ended up being my favorite thing I've written in the book, and ended up capturing the most lasting impression I have from researching and writing Jeep Show, explaining the key to morale for American combat troops. I'll read you the last part of that column. My last words have to be about our boys who went to war on the ground. They were in a completely different army than the armies of the other belligerents. Germany's was an army of professionals up until late in the war. The Red Army was filled out by peasants and factory workers with guns at their backs. The British Army reflected that nation's traditional class distinctions. The Japanese Army was its own feudal society, emphasizing loyalty to superiors and a strong sense of honor and self-sacrifice. By 1944, all four of these armies were wasting assets. America's army was increasing in size and power as the war neared its end. The American Army was larger than the nation's other military services combined. Unlike the Navy and its Marine Corps, the Army had to rely on the draft to fill its ranks. If the other services were to some extent cherry-picked from American society, the Army was America itself, a cross-section of all the nation's geographic, religious, economic, and ethnic groups, including Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, called the Three Fighting Faiths. In service of victory, America invented both the atom bomb and the idea of a Judeo-Christian nation. The Army drafted Americans from the economically backward South to the bustling industrial cities of the Midwest, from the fisheries of Maine to the timber country of the Pacific Northwest, from the Wyoming ranches to the garment factories of New York, from the North Dakota wheat fields to the Mississippi cotton fields. The Army drafted PhDs, the Army drafted immigrants, whom the Army taught to read and write the language of the country they served. It had to be this way, given the manpower needed to fight a world war on two fronts. It was also fitting, given the ideals America said it was fighting for. America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the goddamn Army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy, aka chicken shit. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home. Here is the lesson about morale. We do the hard things. We persevere. We are at our best when we do not for ourselves, but for each other. Greater love hath no one than that. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions now.
Hi, Mr. O'Connor.
Hello, Mr. Kershaw. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I want to say, pleasure to be on the same program with Dr. Doherty and Dr. Lingle.
Wow, two doctors.
Yes, yes.
I'm not feeling that intimidated, and neither should you, because that was a great presentation. There are lots of questions that I have, but I want to ask you first of all about your own background. Why did you write this book?
I wrote it because I am a writer, and given that my father served overseas in World War II at a very young age, I was interested in the topic. But as I said in the presentation, or tried to say, I had actually set out to write a very different book, a marketing related story of the Oxydol Circus, as I said, a marketing disaster in 1968 for Procter & Gamble, humorous only in retrospect. Jim Hetzer, the veteran who inspired the book Jeep Show, was a circus promoter and was actually the promoter who sold the Oxydol detergent brand on sponsoring a circus. So once I found out in the research on that book, once I learned about the life of Jim Hetzer and his service in World War II, MOS 442, Entertainment Specialist, and realized that almost nobody knows about these enlisted entertainers, that became the book I wanted to write.
By the way, I want to thank you so much for your time, but I have a little bone to pick with you, which is the imitation of an English accent left a little bit to be desired, I have to say. But anyway,
I should have prefaced it by saying this is not this is not good.
This is not your native language.
You asked Dr. Doherty a fascinating question about the current generation, and their level of patriotism and how they would react to the situation that our World War II soldiers did. One thing that I discovered in my research was many of these young men were either sons or, like my father, grandsons of immigrants. And the immigrants who made it to the US and stayed in the US were by and large extraordinarily grateful for the life they had found and the life they had escaped. And thus the idea of their sons serving in the military was absolute, came naturally.
Um, we have quite a few questions.
All right.
For some reason, this morning we're getting a lot of questions. I don't know whether people have changed their coffee or what. I'm very happy anyway. Um,
Good.
One of the statements here comes from Colin, and our viewers know Colin very well because he's literally here every Saturday that we do this.
Yeah.
He's 18 years old. He's a high school student, and he loves World War II, obviously. Hasn't yet got sick and tired of a limey on a Saturday morning, which is a miracle.
Yes.
Thank you for your inspiration. We've had a lot of applause that appears on the Zoom as a kind of rising, clapping hand. But anyway, do you have any advice for him as an 18-year-old about what he can do in terms of writing about World War II? Any advice for uh,
Well, the first thing I would say, Colin, is furnish your mind by broad reading of the very best history books of World War II. The trilogy by Atkinson of the American Army, I would strongly recommend. I would strongly recommend Alex's Kershav's book about the Battle of the Bulge, which I just about wore out for researching Jeep Show. I don't think I violated any copyrights, Alex, but
no, carry on. We're going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about my book, which is, by the way, is a paperback. You can buy it now. It makes a fantastic Christmas present. Carry on.
very
Sorry.
good. I feel the same way about Jeep Show. And the last thing for this interesting young man is just start practicing writing. Just start practicing writing because the first 5 million words you write won't be any good, but you'll learn from it.
We have another question from Mike, and he says, "Did any of the frontline entertainers have to participate in actual combat during their tours?"
I am not aware of that. There is very little history to be gained from the archives or other books on the Morale Corps soldiers. So I'd have to say I'm not aware. As I said, I stuck the protagonist, Jim Tanzer, in the Battle of the Bulge, but that was my fictional invention.
Okay, so were there any metrics? Were there any investigations into how effective morale boosting was? Did they have any conclusions or reports about the impact of these brave entertainers?
You know, the Army did a lot of research and sent out questionnaires that were kind of in general about how soldiers were feeling about their experience. I'm not privy to the results of that, and I don't think they focused on frontline combat troops and how they felt about either the Morale Corps. I will tell you that, and you probably know this, Alex, the frontline troops were not crazy about the USO because if they were back in the rear echelon to see a USO show, there'd be, I don't know, several hundred officers in front of them, and they would never get to talk to the performers. Whereas Mickey Rooney does a Jeep show in a barn in Hosingen and is 10 feet away from Company K, and they all hang out afterwards and smoke cigarettes and drink coffee. So different experience.
Um, I want to point out that we have a fellow traveler on our trips to Europe and a big supporter of Friends, which is CW. And his mother, apparently, Holly says, was an entertainer with the British morale
Ah,
horse. So
Ensa,
we have a direct
Ensa.
connect.
Yes, the one thing I also heard about Ensa that the Tommies would joke about was always an accordion and always roll out the barrel.
Do you think that that morale suffered terribly during the Battle of the Bulge? This was a huge intelligence failure. All the troops had been told basically that the war would be over by Christmas of 1944, and yet they are here in the deadliest battle of World War II in actually the coldest. You are right about it being the
Yeah.
coldest winter in living memory, and they are in the moor, and this is a hell of a fight. Did you come across accounts of people whose morale collapsed, who felt bitter about this, who were utterly disillusioned by this enormous setback?
I did not come across that. You mentioned earlier, there were several large surrender groups of troops, but they were led by their officers were the ones that evaluated the situation and decided that surrender was the best course. And we are, and in general, the ability of the surprised, somewhat disorganized, overmanned American combat troops to stand and fight was, in retrospect, somewhat amazing and is, I think, a testimony to, first of all, their training and, of course, their officers, but also their fellow feeling for each other. So I think there was overall very high morale as a result of the combat.
Um, I wanted to ask you about morale. Why were you interested in this issue of morale? Is there something in your life that made this more interesting for you?
Yes, and my first book was literally about the topic of morale. I had an experience in my life where various forces seemed to act on me, and I went through just a really hard time. And with the help of family and friends and a counselor and other things, I got through it and was able to look back on it and say, what was affecting me? And so I wrote a book about it called Gumption Aid, using that old-timey word. And thus the morale core was of great interest to me.
We have a question from George. Were any women frontline entertainers? So that's redefine frontline entertainers as actually women that were in units like the Jeep Show, where they actually go beyond where the USO went. Were there any women in?
Uh, as far, I am not aware of any women in those units. I will tell you, I did learn that there was a fatality of a female USO performer. The truck went over a mine. So I believe the only USO performer, and of course they were more towards the rear, the only USO performer fatality was a woman.
Okay. Um, have you seen the TV show Combat? Have you seen that?
I think I saw a few episodes in 1968, when I was 12 years old.
I mean, I would argue, I've seen it, and I would argue that Combat's actually perhaps the most realistic account or rendering of what it was like to be a GI in a foxhole in combat in the European theatre. Interestingly, it came out at the height of the Vietnam War.
Right.
So, what other accounts have you looked at and read or watched which have been most impactful for you, that have been most have felt most accurate in terms of describing the reality of frontline combat?
First of all, I read many. I read about five books literally covering the Battle of the Bulge. Yours was the one that was I found the most useful. I found a book that was written by the daughter of a lieutenant in that Company K in Hosingen on December 16th, and a detailed account of what that company went through. And so that helped me create Jim Tanzer's frontline experience on the morning of December 16th. I will tell you that I watched many movies with a notepad in front of me, and I thought that Ken Burns' The War was particularly helpful in understanding the psychology of frontline troops, the interviews in that. As I said, I watched many Army training films. I did watch Stage Door Canteen a couple of times. One of your listeners mentioned that, 19, I think 43 movie. So many books, many movies, many films. I'm sure, Alex, you've never done this, but I probably over-researched the book because research is fun and writing is hard. And for example, the famous evangelical preacher Billy Sunday makes an appearance, a very brief appearance in the book, and that was probably 3 months research and a month of writing, which and my editor dispatched it very quickly.
Well, we have a comment from David Trail. Thanks, David, for joining us yet again. He organizes a lot of stuff for us, including school visits to Florida coming up in January.
Yeah.
And he says, my friend Richard Rossi, I interviewed him for us as part of his conference series last year. He's 102. This is a gentleman called Richard Rossi, and was in a special service unit that did Jeep shows. He played with Mickey Rooney, the Andrews sisters, and others after being plucked out of the Bulge. His interview and others can be found on our website. I would encourage everybody watching to visit our website because there's an awful lot of really good material there. And then we have Kathy saying, my aunt was an army nurse in the 39th Field Hospital. Her unit was assigned to the 9th Air Force to follow it across Europe. She was in 3 major battles, including the Battle of the Bulge. Seems the medical corps is all but forgotten in World War II. Why is that? Why have apparently we've all forgotten about the medical corps, but do you think that they haven't had enough praise, that there isn't enough written about the medical corps?
You know, I'm hardly an expert. I would say though, as that it's probably a case that the movies and the books that are very popular are following more the combat soldiers and the combat airmen just out of dramatic interest. I will point out, and your listener probably knows this, but there was a company, a medical corps company, that was captured by the Germans just outside of Bastogne. And that was one reason why there was the circumstances for wounded soldiers in Bastogne became so difficult, was that the attached company had been captured by the Germans.
You could argue that on the 17th of December 1944, the infamous Malbany massacre, where over 80 American POWs were machine gunned to death by the SS, you could argue that that was by far the most effective morale booster of of the battle, and let alone the Battle of the Bulge, but of World War II, because the veterans I interviewed that had survived the Battle of the Bulge all remembered hearing about that massacre on the 17th of December. And for some reason, a couple of them told me, for some reason, news like that spreads like wildfire. And talk about adding a pep to their
Yeah.
step.
Yes.
And this is an important point because one of the big problems we had in World War II, and I'm talking about the Americans now, was actually getting young Americans to kill Germans. So in a
Yeah.
firefight, in a firefight where bullets are coming at you, where it's kill or be killed, only around about a third of American citizen soldiers actually returned fire, even though they were in the heat of battle where their lives were on the line. We just didn't hate them. Eisenhower worried about this. Patton was very concerned about it. how do you get working class citizen soldiers thousands and thousands of miles away from home who've grown up in the ways of peace and democracy, as Roosevelt said, to be killers? Because it's killing that wins you a war. So I think that I wanted to add that because
Yeah.
you can look at morale in two ways. Look at it in terms of losing morale, or from the top brass's point of view, morale really counted when it came to aggression,
Yeah.
maximum violence, and carrying on killing. How do you feel about that?
Well, I have a one-word answer to the question about how you get, citizen soldiers to fire upon European enemies, and that answer is sergeants.
Well,
That's how you
that's
do it.
that's a very good answer. A
Yeah.
very good answer.
I'd also want to point out, that the Malmedy massacre, that was SS troops. And the SS troops, like most German soldiers, had been fighting for a long time on the Russian front. And unfortunately, on the Russian front, killing POWs on both sides was routine. And thus, this SS unit was just carrying out what they were used to, does not excuse murder, mass murder in any way, but it was almost for those SS units, that's war. Whereas for the regular Wehrmacht units, and in particular for the Volksgrenadiers, they were very similar to American soldiers in their outlook on it. And thus, the American soldiers did not feel that the Germans were naturally their enemy. And of course, in the Pacific, it was almost a race war.
Yeah.
The American soldiers in the Pacific did not feel the same way about the Japanese soldiers.
So, last question, and I want to thank you so much, Bob, for joining us. I really enjoyed your book. It's wonderful. I recommend to everybody the book because it's great to read a novelistic account of a true situation. You can use your imagination, it opens your heart, your soul, etc. Because a lot of World War II history can be very dry and not very humanistic. I wanted to ask you one last question. We're coming up to the 81st anniversary of the deadliest battle of World War II for Americans. Why do we even care about this anymore? Why is it important that we all be here and talk about this? What is important about your book and the study of World War II history 81 years later? Why should we do it?
I think the most important lesson of the Battle of the Bulge is, for me, of course, the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. So if we are interested in U.S. military history, we must become familiar with that. Perhaps after D-Day, the most important large-scale event of the war. And then secondly, the resilience, and in particular, the defense of Bastogne and Patton's Third Army coming up from the south to relieve Bastogne. And for me, the story of the team snafu, situation normal, all left up, the cooks, the barbers, the mechanics, as I said, one entertainment soldier who were organized into combat units under pressure in Bastogne and fought and died alongside the 101st Airborne. For me, tremendous lesson in morale and training and uh, just the very best of courage.